So we're going to start off the study, the book of Esther. We'll just start off by saying that the book of Esther is very unique. Uh, One thing that you will notice as we go through this chapter by chapter is that this is the only book in the entire Bible that does not mention God. Uh, it's pretty odd. There's not even a divine title, there's not a pronoun that even refers to God. But yet, it mentions a heathen king 192 times. Prayer is not ever mentioned. Of course, if God's not mentioned, then prayer wouldn't be either. Uh, the book of Esther is never quoted in the New Testament. It's not even casually referred to in the New Testament. But superstition of the heathen is mentioned, and we'll be introduced into a pagan heathen court of this monarch who ruled over the known world. It is a very unusual book, especially when we say that it is a God breathed book. But yet, in the events that we see in this book, we can see God working. We can see that God acts on behalf of his people. And not only that, but we can also see a few types and illustrations of the gospel and a little bit of prophecy truth uh, that are clearly signatures of the Almighty. And that's what we're really going to concentrate on as we go through this study. There's a lot of insight in this book as far as the life that we live as Christians, as well as things that are still to come. So let's get started. Esther chapter 1, 1 and 2. Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel of Susa. So while the author of this book, nobody's really sure of, some people suggest that it's Mordecai, which we will get to know a lot better later on. Uh, Somewhere around 465 BC. Some scholars say that this book and the events in it take place over a 10-year period, 483 to 473 BC, during the reign of Xerxes. Uh, Ahasuerus is the Hebrew name for Xerxes. Esther chapter 1, 3 through 8. In the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. When these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen, held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings and marble columns, and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty. The drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion, for so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. So, this king decides to throw a banquet. Now, obviously, this was a very humble affair because the king didn't want to flaunt his wealth and his power in the people's faces, did he? Actually, it's the complete opposite. He wanted to flaunt his power and his wealth, and he wanted to display his riches. So he gave a couple of banquets. The first lasted a mere 180 days. This banquet would have been for the upper class. This would have included princes, nobles, army officers. Had we lived 2,500 years ago in Susa, there is a very good chance that me and probably you would have missed out on this one. We would have been waiting for an invitation that never got there. But we would have made it to the second one. The second one was a 7 day banquet for everyone, and it involved the finest of everything the king could display. Read some of the things that it says: hangings of fine white and violet linen held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings of marble columns, couches of gold and silver on mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. And there was a fair amount of wine to go around too. So it's here that I wonder, isn't it worth stop to think about our King, the King of Kings? In what ways does he display the riches of his glory? Have you ever read that term in the New Testament? Do you know what it relates to? Now, in contrast to this king, Xerxes, God in our time displays the riches of his glory in all that he does in and through our lives. His glory is his grace, his character, and his nature. And these riches are all displayed and bound up in the person of Jesus Christ. God has given him to all who believe. Paul writes about this in Colossians 1:27, to whom God willed to make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And in Ephesians 3:16 and 17, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love. So, just like in the days of Esther, this banquet where the wealthy and the poor were invited to the banquet, so are the wealthy and the poor invited to receive the riches of God's glory today. Some people refuse the invitation, but it is still there. It's an invitation to participate in this banquet feast in a kingdom where even creation itself will be free from corruption. As we read in Romans 8:21 that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. And the true extent of these riches of the glory of God will be displayed through all of God's people. These who have accepted the invitation and are heirs with his Son. As he writes again in Colossians 3:4, when Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. Esther, chapter 1, 9 through 12. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Bagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. So this third banquet was held by Queen Vashti. It was a banquet for the women of the palace. Uh, and it seems like they were pretty uh, big on keeping their banquet separated from this drunken party that the men were having. I say that's pretty fair, pretty smart. Some say that the custom then was to have separate banquets, and I can see why, because the men would find their banquet into a drunken debacle. And we see that a problem arises on this last day when a drunken king called for the queen to come and display her beauty before all these men. And this is a question I would ask to every woman. Would you like to be gawked at by a room full of men who have been drinking for 7 days, paraded around? Right or wrong, but I personally can understand why she didn't want to go. She refused. People, even queens here, do not refuse the king and get away with it. So there's trouble brewing already. Esther chapter 1, 13 through 22. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king, so to speak, before all who knew law and justice and were close to him, Carshena, Shethar, Adamatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsana, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. According to law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. In the presence of the king and princes, Memucan said, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the princes and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought into his presence, but she did not come. This day the ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's conduct, will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger. If it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. When the king's edict, which he will make, is heard throughout all his kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. This word pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So he sent letters to all the king's province, to each province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, that every man should be the master in his own house, and one who speaks in the language of his own people. So he is furious, and he asked his men, his wise men, what should be done to the queen for refusing this invitation. And Memucan, who sees an opportunity here, suggests that this may not be an isolated incident, and if it is gone unpunished, that wives throughout the kingdom will rise up and rebel against their husbands. Sounds like feminism. There is also a story here that we can learn something from when a man comes into an office and is bragging to everybody that his wife has called him a model husband. When he makes this brag to a very hard nosed secretary, she is very unimpressed. And she says to him, Hey, why don't you look up the term model in the dictionary and you may not be so proud. So he did exactly what she said, and he was quickly disheartened because the definition of model was a small imitation of the original. It was henpecked. This is who Memucan would be. He said loud and clear that something must be done to protect our homes in this matter. And he said that it was a real crisis because the queen and the king set an example for the kingdom. I would think that he might have been a little bit melodramatic there, but the king isn't in the mood for mercy and he agrees. So Vashti, because of her refusal to go, is stripped of being the queen. She's no longer allowed to enter into the king's presence. And letters are sent out to the king's provinces stating that the man is the head and the master of the household. Take also note that this decree, when things are written into the laws of Persia and Media, they cannot be altered or repealed. This will be very important later. So we see an illustration here that we can find in the New Testament when the true King, the God of heaven and earth, is inviting many to come to the banquet feast to honor his son. those that come find the riches of God's grace and bless upon their lives. Just like the people who came to the banquet found an abundance that the king provided. And just like Vashti, when we refuse, we will not be allowed to enter into the king's presence. And it is something that cannot be overturned or repealed. Now, there are some who believe that if we refuse now, we will have another chance in our next life to accept. This is not what the Bible teaches us. The Bible teaches that now is the day of salvation. Now is the day of grace. If a person dies and they refuse the invitation to come, they will not only be sent out of his presence, but they will be sent to hell. No second chance. Jesus plainly says in Matthew 7:21 through 23, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. This verse has been known to give many true Christians a fear, but it shouldn't give us fear, because this is talking about the ones who he doesn't know. True believers, Jesus says, I know my sheep, and they'll never perish. But it should be a very clear warning to people who put their faith in the things that they've done and not what Jesus has did. Those that will enter into heaven are those who do the Father's will. Sounds like work. Sounds like based on something we do. And it can kind of be confusing unless we look in the Bible to see what it is that the Father's will is. The disciples questioned this, and they asked Jesus what it was, and he told them very plainly in John 6:27 through 29. Do not work for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him the Father God has set his seal. Therefore they said to him, what shall we do, so that we may work the works of God? Jesus answered and said to them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. Chapter 1 of Esther is all about the invitation to the banquet and a refusal of Vashti to come. She's banished, and a new bride will have to be found. And that's what we're going to look at in the next chapter, because it involves selection and the preparation of the one who will be king. And there's all kinds of gospel truth in our preparation as the bride of Jesus. That is next time.